Working longer doesn't actually mean that you're working better. And it also doesn't mean that you're working harder than anyone else. It could also be hurting your performance. Today, let's talk about how you can exit your hustle era without shrinking your ambition. Grab your cup of tea and let's dive into it. So, today I want to talk about hustle culture and how pushing yourself with these endless hours that lead to burnout could actually also be harming your results. And I say this from the perspective of someone that has actively participated in hustle culture up until only the last few years. For example, when I was in my 20s, I was working as a marketing manager for a multi brand, a well known organization in the area that I live in South Australia. And this was quite a demanding job. And on top of that, I would work on the weekends. I'd work every Friday night and through the weekend in my job in fashion as well. And if that wasn't enough, I was also studying with the Chartered Institute of Marketing. And even with that schedule, I was not a homebody during my 20s. I was as social as I possibly could be. So I had a jam packed calendar. And then later, I moved into a role in sports marketing and communications. And that is an industry that truly does not stop. There is no time that is ever called on that industry when it comes to behind the scenes in sports. It is an always on industry for a lot of people. And now, in my more recent years, I am loving my work from home life, and I love seeing this rising trend of the anti hustle culture because so many people are switching on to this not being a sustainable way to live. But what I really love the most about this trend is that it's not actually about shrinking your ambition, it's about having these big goals but also having a balance. It's about your work not being this performative ambition, but instead, this is about genuine productivity, the kind of work that has a high impact. And so many savvy leaders and emerging professionals are switching on to this idea that just because you work many hours, it doesn't actually mean that you're working better or harder than anyone else. So just because you have stayed back in the office, it doesn't mean that you're a harder worker or that you're a more effective worker. All it could actually mean was that you weren't efficient enough to get everything that you needed to done during the allocated time. But as a side note to that, they could also be an issue with the workload that you have, which is a whole other conversation. But when it comes to just putting in the hours for the sake of putting in the hours, it doesn't mean that you are yielding positive results. And also, if you're the kind of person who posts a lot on social media about how hard you work, or you might know someone who does, all this really means is that that person chose to post about how much they work. It doesn't actually mean that they are a better worker or a harder worker than anyone else. They're just choosing to communicate about that. And that is totally up to them if they want to do that. But I prefer to aim for a different approach, which is to join the new rich, which is something that I talked about in one of my earlier episodes. It is a sentiment that comes from Tim Ferriss's book, The 4-Hour Work Week, which has an absolute cult following. And in the book, Tim Ferriss, who is very successful, says, "Less is not laziness. Doing less meaningless things so you can focus on things of greater personal importance is not laziness. This is hard to accept as our culture tends to reward personal sacrifice instead of personal productivity." So remember that your ambition doesn't shrink just as you gain more experience or more knowledge. It just gets smarter. So to begin with, I want to talk about the law of diminishing returns, which is a really nice way to package up this idea that increased input doesn't actually yield a better result. The law of diminishing returns, which is a classic economic concept, describes that when you keep increasing one input, such as effort, time, or labor, while other inputs stay the same. The additional output you get from each unit of input will eventually decrease. So, simply put, this means that you are productive to a certain point, and then after that point, your outcomes will decline. So, this was an idea that was formalized into economics in the 19th century, but it actually started to develop its roots in the 1700s when it was applied to farming. And they started to notice that when you add additional labor to a fixed piece of land, eventually you will get a lesser crop yield per worker. Okay, so let's apply this to your everyday life and say that you are working on a report. When you work on that report for the first 2 hours, you're likely going to see some significant results in the output, in the outcomes that you have achieved for that report. Say you start to then work on that report for 5 hours, you're likely to still see some improvement, but the gain that you have gotten from those 5 hours may be less than the 2 hours that you initially spent on that report. Then you start to push yourself to work on that report for 8 hours. And this may be an example of pushing past your ideal productivity and your results start to decline. So you might start to find yourself making errors or just not writing in the best possible way. This is the law of diminishing returns. You are productive to a certain point. So if you wanted to put this law into action, keep this in mind when you are scheduling your day. How can you account for the law of diminishing returns so that all of the input that you put into, say, a certain project is going to be the highest possible quality? So, how can you, for example, schedule your projects or the different things that you are working on or need to attend to across your week to try and avoid the law of diminishing returns having a negative impact on your results? You're scheduling your calendar for optimal performance. And speaking of optimal performance, let's talk about point number 2, which is the productive zone of disequilibrium. This was something that I first learned about in one of my very first courses when I did my MBA. It was actually my first course and one of the first topics that we talked about. And I could be getting this wrong, but I think from memory, this was a course that was based on a Harvard course. So this is a high quality course that talked about this idea of the productive zone of disequilibrium. And this is a concept that represents the optimal level of tension, of stress, of discomfort to motivate change. And that is without causing paralysis or chaos. And it uses this idea of heat as a part of this concept. So, leaders, for example, are encouraged to try and turn up the heat when it comes to pushing that productive zone of disequilibrium. But it's really important that you understand the level of heat that you are operating in or that you are creating. So, for example, if there is a low level of heat, this is going to create complacency and it's not going to lead to any change. Whereas if there is a medium level of heat, if you turn up that heat slightly, then that is going to create learning and adaptation, growth, and change. But if you turn up that heat too high, then you've pushed past that zone of productive disequilibrium. And this is what starts to create overwhelm and resistance and breakdown. So the key is maintaining that optimal level of stress. And if you are applying this to your everyday, then check in on the level of heat that you are creating, even just for yourself. For example, if you are working on a task, do a little temperature check with yourself. Ask yourself, does this feel too easy? Or at the opposite end, ask yourself, have I pushed myself too far? I personally like to try and make sure that I'm doing at least one thing every day that makes me feel uncomfortable. And another way that this could manifest is in the form of having a stretch goal. So, for example, what is it that feels like it is a stretch from what is naturally comfortable, but it still feels doable? It still feels achievable. And this is something that is used a lot in business or when it comes to sales, for example. It's having the actual goal that you want to make for that particular day, and then it's having a stretch goal. So you know that, yes, it's great if you achieve that goal, but then it's also fantastic if you achieve the stretch goal. And the stretch goal is designed to be something that is doable. But remember, this is about making sure that you aren't creating complete overwhelm. So let's talk about number 3 and micro breaks. So these are essentially mini built-in recovery sessions. Now, if you follow this channel, you might know that I love all things productivity. For example, I have read just recently in the last year over 150 books, and I still read 3 books a week. I have spoken on this channel about having higher value hobbies, and I've also talked about how to find an extra 40 hours in your week by identifying 3 key time wasters. So I know for me and a lot of other people, when it comes to your work or your personal development or your professional development, it's not actually procrastination that's the problem. It's stopping that is the problem. This is something that I've tried to spend more time embracing, particularly in the last few months. And I actually did a whole other episode recently on your boredom advantage, because I've been learning more and more about the benefits of actually pausing and the power of breaks and what that can do for your performance. And so now this is something that I am actually trying to build into my schedule, because I know that while it might not necessarily come so naturally to me, it's something that is going to elevate my performance in the long run. And I also work from home, like a lot of people are doing now. And when you work from home, if you are like some people, you might actually struggle to take a break because you don't have as many of those natural interruptions. So for example, when I worked in an office, there was always people that I was chatting to or people that were popping in to discuss things. And so as much as I love really deep focused work, it means that when I work from home and I have more control over the way that I work and my environment, I have to build in those mini breaks. I have to build in those recovery sessions from that deep focused work, knowing that this is what's going to lead to more sustainable performance. And this leads me to the idea of attention restoration theory, which is this idea that deep work relies on directed attention. But this is a system that naturally fatigues over time. So even brief mental pauses will help to restore your focus. So it acknowledges that there are limitations to our attention. And this really relates to a lot of our natural biology as well. Our body has this natural 90-minute energy cycle. So we go through periods of peak productivity, and then we have this natural dip that requires a recovery. And a lot of people will ignore this, which is what leads to fatigue, to reduced performance, to burnout. But micro breaks allow you to reset within your cycles instead of crashing out at the end of them. It is a way to work with your biology instead of against it. So remember, your productivity isn't linear, it is cyclical. And micro breaks aren't a distraction from the work, they support sustained high performance without depletion. So to put this into context as to how this idea of anti-hustle actually works for me, I often regularly work 12-hour days, but they feel so different to how I used to work in the past because they are built in with these micro breaks. Actually, as I talk about this reminds me of a book that I was reading last week on Kobe Bryant and his routines. And he used to have this really intense workout routine. So he would work out and train multiple times a day. Very famously, he would have these midnight sessions and he would also often wake up at 3 a.m. And he definitely admits that sleep was not something that he prioritized. But what I thought was really interesting about his schedule was that there were these built-in breaks. There were lots of different breaks that worked quite differently to a normal 9 to 5, very differently to a normal 9 to 5. So he would have these periods of really peak high performance, and then he would take a break and he would hang out with his wife and his children. And it was just a really different way to look at this hustle culture, because obviously he is an absolute icon when it comes to hustling and achieving your goals, but he had a really interesting way of doing it. But your micro breaks also don't need to be these huge chunks of time. They can actually also be just mini, really short, tiny breaks during your day. So, for example, how can you make sure that you are pausing for at least 30 seconds while you are in deep focus, or even for a few minutes? Or you might also try micro shifts, such as looking away from your screen for a minute, or taking the time to step outside of your office or outside of your home to change your environment for a minute and allow your body to recover that cognitive energy again. But you also don't need to just take these mini breaks. You can take mini retirements, which is my point number 4. And this was an idea that also came from Tim Ferriss in the 4-Hour Work Week. So what his idea of mini retirements are essentially retiring more often. So he talks about a lot of people having what he describes as a deferred life plan. So you're waiting for your retirement so you can start to enjoy your life and start living and doing all those things that you want to do in your downtime. But what he proposes is that you, number one, maybe never have to ever retire if that's what you choose to do, but you can retire more often. So you, for example, can take those 20 or 30 years that you expect to have during your retirement and spread that out throughout your life. So, for example, you can take holidays, you can switch off, and the way that he describes how you can do that is through these systems that you have set up to work for you while you aren't working. That's the whole idea of the 4-Hour Work Week. And what he talks about, which really resonates with me and how I used to operate, is that a lot of people, for example, will binge travel on these rare opportunities as though they are, as he describes, starved dogs. Whereas the new rich, as he calls them, they enjoy travel regularly, and they also don't completely rely on travel because there isn't this constant feeling of needing to escape, because they're doing more meaningful work as well, and they have these systems set up for them for when they do want to take time off. So if you do want to learn more about the habits of the new rich, then check out my previous episode on this. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next episode.